Good morning. We are here today, as my eminent predecessors have noted, because we want a world in which older people are as healthy as possible, are safe and secure, and participate in making that world. Think how much easier this would be if everyone knew these things. Longevity is a hallmark of human progress. Life expectancy increases along with more education, greater wealth, lower infant mortality, better public health, and less war. Experience is irreplaceable. Perspective is priceless, obviously. Age is a criterion for diversity. It belongs alongside race, gender, sexual orientation, and ability. Ageism is as unacceptable as sexism or racism. We know these other forms of discrimination are wrong, and it is time to stop giving ageism a pass. Allocating resources by age is unacceptable. Why does weighing the needs of the very old against the very young go unchallenged? Making the same case on the basis of race or sex would be unthinkable. Human rights do not diminish with age. A long past is no less valuable than a long future. So why don't more people think this way? Because of capitalism. When the value of a human being is tethered to conventional economic productivity, the young, old, and disabled are more likely to be left behind, to be sick, and to be poor. Because of consumer culture. If aging equals illness, we can be sold stuff to cure it. If aging is a problem, we can be sold stuff to fix it. Aging is not a disease or a problem to be cured. It is a natural, powerful, lifelong process that unites us all. And because of ageism, treating people differently because of how old we think they are. Ageism is to age what racism is to race. Both are socially constructed ideas that change over time and that serve a social and economic purpose. They are not about how we look. They are about how people in power assign meaning to how we look. Isms operate by pitting us against each other, native-born against immigrants, working moms against stay-at-home moms, young against old, in order to maintain the status quo. Ageism is why Wikipedia says that the International Day of Older Persons, quote, raises awareness about issues affecting the elderly, such as senescence, which would be the gradual deterioration of function, and elder abuse, unquote. Today's theme, Take a Stand Against Ageism, is going to change that. The stakes are high. As General Ban Ki-moon pointed out in a recent UN report, quote, the social and economic implications of population aging are profound, touching broader society and the global community in unprecedented ways, unquote. Some people see population aging as a gray tsunami of incapacitated freeloaders washing over us. Others see it as a silver reservoir, an unprecedented opportunity to tap into the social capital of millions more healthy, well-educated adults than ever before in human history. To take advantage of this longevity dividend, we need to challenge the ageist assumptions that underlie the hand-wringing. Otherwise, older people will not have equal rights in any domain, whether retirement homes or refugee camps. Otherwise, unless we take a stand against ageism, the rest is noise. It never dawns on most of us that the experience of reaching old age, or middle age, or even just aging past youth can be better or worse depending on the culture in which it takes place. The more clearly we see these social forces at work in ourselves and in the world at large, the easier it is to envision alternative, more accurate, and more positive narratives. The longer we wait to confront ageism, the more damage it does. Negative stereotypes are drummed into us since childhood by the media and popular culture. Wrinkles are ugly. It's sad to be old. Older people are incompetent. Unless we challenge them, they build up over the decades, making older adults the worst ageist of all. Over time, we tend to act as though these stereotypes were accurate, and that creates self-fulfilling prophecies. We blame every ache on age and every memory lapse on incipient dementia, losing sight of the fact that the other knee doesn't hurt and that kids forget stuff all the time too. That is internalized ageism. That's what's going on when people refuse to use walkers or wheelchairs because the stigma is so great, even when it means never leaving home. It's why we feel shame instead of pride at the accomplishment of aging. It's why we blame ourselves for failing to age successfully when we can't open a jar or need help on the stairs. The real culprit is the ageism that makes these natural transitions shameful and way more difficult than they ought to be. A growing body of evidence shows that attitudes towards aging have an actual measurable effect on how our brains and bodies function at the cellular level. People with more positive feelings about aging do better on memory tests. They walk faster, and they're more likely to recover completely from severe disability. They live longer, a whopping 7.5 years longer, and they live better. Age denial, on the other hand, keeps many people from making the lifestyle chances that pay off in the long run. One thing we can all agree on, health has the biggest effect on how we age and how much it costs. So think what a global anti-ageism campaign could do to extend not just lifespan, but health span, and it's really exciting to see the World Health Organization getting on board with that. Or I'm getting on board with them, I should say. So what's most people's biggest fear about aging? Mine, for sure, dementia. There is no evidence that brain training or exercise confers any real protection against it. But study after study shows that attitudes towards aging matter a lot. People with negative beliefs are more likely to get the kind of brain damage associated with Alzheimer's disease. Other brains with the same plaques and tangles continue to function just fine. What do the high-functioning brains have in common? They belong to people with positive attitudes about late life, people who have a sense of purpose. Since there's no cure for Alzheimer's on the horizon, it makes sense to invest in prevention, helping people find meaningful roles as we age. What's the biggest obstacle? Ageism, structural discrimination against older people, which sets us up for premature mental and physical decline. Longer lives require working longer and saving more. And yet 2/3 of older job seekers report encountering discrimination. And that means over 40, right? It starts young. Not one of the stereotypes that employers use to justify it, that older workers are less productive, less dependable, less committed, less creative, to name just a few, not one is true. Nor do older workers crowd out younger ones. When olders have jobs, youngers are more likely to be employed and to earn more. When jobs are scarce, it's a labor market problem, not a too many old people problem. The consequences of ageism in the workplace are disastrous. Depressed and diminished, many older people quit looking for work and become economically dependent, contributing to the misperception that olders are a net burden to society. How it's not by choice. And how are we supposed to remain economically self-sufficient if we're forced out of the labor market? Most older people are women whose prospects are limited by the toxic combination of ageism and sexism. The effects are ongoing, cumulative, and compounded by race and class. In many countries, older women are less educated than men, which reduces their access to jobs and to health care. They are more likely to be abused and less likely to own or inherit property. Women outlive their male counterparts, and living alone increases the risks of poverty and isolation. In the workplace, older women report the highest level of bullying, suffer the highest wage gap, and that gap kicks in the US at age 32, when women start getting passed over for promotion. And employers stop investing in women's careers a decade earlier than men's. Women are penalized for time spent out of the workforce, typically on unpaid caregiving. They're less likely to get a pension, and if they do, it's worth less. Many end up in poverty for the first time in their lives as they enter the ranks of the very old, if not before. We know that older women across the world support children. When they have less, so do their families. Quote, ageism allows the younger generations to see older people as different than themselves. Thus, they subtly cease to identify with their elders as human beings, unquote, wrote eminent geriatrician Robert Butler, who coined the word ageism in 1969 to piggyback alongside sexism and racism, which were getting recognized at that time. Their welfare seems less of a human right. In the United States, 5 out of 6 cases of elder abuse go unreported. Unlike child abuse and domestic abuse, we don't talk about it much. Structural ageism collides with internalized ageism when victims are ashamed to ask for help and think they might not deserve it. Discrimination also sanctions segregation and isolation, the biggest threats to an active and fulfilling old age. So what can we do to take a stand against ageism? Adopt a UN Convention on the Rights of Older People. The UN has already adopted conventions on the rights of women, children, and people with disabilities. A convention on the rights of older people would buttress those rights because women make up the majority of older people, because age discrimination also marginalizes children. It cuts both ways. And because so many of us age into disability. These rights are as important as those of any group, and every group is made up of the old and the future old. It's not just about protecting the frail and vulnerable either. Olders deserve recognition and representation. A convention would articulate those rights and compel governments to enforce them. It would reflect the 21st century reality that population aging is a global phenomenon that is here to stay. It would channel resources into much-needed infrastructure for aging societies. And above all, a UN Convention on the Rights of Older People would remind legislators, policymakers, and the global community that human rights do not diminish with age. Conduct more research on older people in all our diversity, as the ambassador called for. Although the world population is aging at an unprecedented rate everywhere, higher in the developed world, but everywhere, we don't collect data on older people. International data on poverty among olders, HIV/AIDS, and older people in humanitarian situations is scanty or missing entirely. Global indicators used to measure violence against women stop at age 49, when we cease to be reproductively useful. Over half of the world's 194 countries had to be left off the 2015 Global Age Watch Index, which ranks countries by how well their older citizens are faring, because data sets on millions of older people were missing entirely. Not only do we need more information to be collected across more decades, we need it to be disaggregated, which is a fancy word for broken down by age, sex, ethnicity, education, income, and health, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. That's why geriatricians say, if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old. Each group of olders, urban or rural, educated or illiterate, women or men, has specific needs and capacities. We need data that tell a whole story so we can tailor programs and interventions to those needs. Otherwise, despite all the ways in which older people contribute socially and economically, we remain invisible. All change starts with awareness. The critical starting point is to examine our own age bias, counterintuitively, to look for evidence that you are ageist, not for evidence that you're not, because we can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it. Everyone is ageist. And then work towards making our own behavior and beliefs less biased, an ongoing task, as I am reminded on a regular basis. And speaking up when we encounter discrimination, like when everyone in a group is the same age, for example, unless there's a really good reason. Educating others, tactfully and thoughtfully, sends that change outward like ripples on a pond. That's how we change the culture. Ending ageism will require nothing less than a mass movement. It's a big ask. But slavery was fundamental to the American economy until the abolitionist movement turned it into a crisis. Brutal segregation was a reality for Black South Africans until the anti-apartheid movement rose up against it. Women were second-class citizens until the women's movement catalyzed a mass shift of consciousness. It woke women up to the fact that what felt like personal problems, such as not being able to get a job or being demeaned or not getting heard, sounds familiar, right? Were actually widely shared political problems that require collective action. If we want to have an impact, to make the most of longer lives in every arena, from how we feel when we look in the mirror to foregrounding a global human rights issue, we need to work together to make ageism no more acceptable than any other form of prejudice. It's going to be a struggle. Ageism is woven deeply into our capitalist system, and upending it will involve social and political upheaval. It's going to mean a lot of uncomfortable conversations, reassessments, and outright conflict, not just over health care and housing, but about when we stop valuing people and why. Not because we grow old, but because we do so in an ageist society. That struggle is essential if we want to create a world in which people can find meaning and purpose at every stage of life. Confronting ageism will do more than make it easier for us to carry out our respective missions, and it's really exciting to see that everyone in this room is behind it. All forms of discrimination, ageism, sexism, racism, disableism, homophobia, compound and reinforce each other. So when we make the world better to grow old in, we also make it a better place to be young or female, a person of color or with a disability, a better place to be human. Taking a stand against ageism benefits us all, and it's time. Thank you.
Ms. Applewhite, I want to thank you for those inspirational remarks. And to the barriers, folks, it's time to take a stand.